traeth Porthmawr yn Sir Benfro, un o'r traethau gorau a lleoliad poblogaidd i ymwelwyr i'r ardal. Ond dros 1000 o flynyddoedd yn ôl, cafodd y traeth hwn ei ddefnyddio ar gyfer pwrpas cwbl gwahanol.
There's a stone-built chapel here, which probably dates to the 12th, 13th or 14th century, which was then ruined by the year 1600. We knew there was going to be graves here because they were rode down to the sand, but what's come as quite a surprise is just how complex the site is. There's an awful lot more stratified deposits here than we expected it to be. Very complex site, that's why it's taken so long to excavate and why we're being so careful. At the bottom of the archaeological deposits is a large stone wall that's probably pre-7th century. So between that and the 13th, 14th century chapel, there's a whole series of graves and other things. So this is St Patrick's Chapel, and the reason why we're doing the excavation is quite clear. There's the sea, there's the site of the chapel, and it's obviously eroding by the sea, and it's been known to be eroding for many decades now. But last year, 2014, following big storms, several graves were exposed in the sand dunes.
Allwch chi gweld pa mor agos mae Capel Sant Padrig at y môr, ac mae erydiad y tir wedi bod yn broblem ers talwm. Ar ôl y stormydd yn 2014, cawsant cyllid gan y Llywodraeth Cymraeg trwy cadw mwyn cloddio'r safle. Dyn ni yn ôl nawr yn 2015 mwyn cario ymlaen y gwaith hyn i sicrhau na fydd unrhyw tystiolaeth archeolegol eraill yn cael ei golli i'r môr.
Last year, 2014, we dealt with the immediate threat to the site. These are the burials which are being exposed and actually eroded. This year, we're doing a second strip a bit further inland, but still affected by erosion. So the first few days were quite hard work taking off sand and salt which accumulated over the past, I suppose, several hundred years. About a metre or so depth of that, so it's quite hard work to get down to the architectural layers. And so we got down to those, then we started going more carefully, started to record things in great detail, slowly excavating down through the top layers and just going down and down through time basically. Although we're working mostly at a higher level up there somewhere on the early medieval cemetery, there's actually a lot more happening on this site earlier on than first appears. So we've got a build-up of sand here, very pure wind-blown sand, which is then darker here, which is a soil development. The sand stabilised for perhaps several hundred years, and then at some point there's been a change and sand has accumulated again. And you see here another start layer where vegetation has formed again, a turf line has formed, and then that's then been engulfed by more sand. So between here and here is a considerable time span. But interestingly, this particular layer here, it's a very dark layer, seems to go right across the whole site underneath everything, and we can date this by radiocarbon dating. There is charcoal in this layer, so we get radiocarbon dates from this. This other layer here is quite interesting because it seems to have developed against one of the buildings we have, which the wall is in the background there. So this actually is part of the early medieval archaeology of the site. This is a soil level which a building was in use behind me, which still predates the early medieval cemetery, but is of interest itself. So we have then got this wind-blown sand which accumulated as the building behind me was slowly falling apart. And you can see again in the background a kissed grave cut down through the wind-blown sand, down, and into these layers here. This is the end of a grave, which is going that way, and we'll excavate that in the near future. So all this wind-blown sand has accumulated. Once the building's gone out of use, graves dug through it. So it's a very complex history going down. What we'd like to do eventually is get down below this level here to get to the soil level before sand began to accumulate, which will be in the prehistoric period. We don't know when, but I suspect it's around about 1500, 2000 BC when the soil started to accumulate.
Rydym wedi bod yn cloddio'r safle am dipyn dros wythnos ac wedi gwneud cynnydd sylweddol yn barod.
But once we get down to the top of the archaeological deposits, we treat everything very carefully. The first thing we do is record everything by drawings, by photographs, written descriptions, and then we start to excavate, slowly removing things very slowly in most cases. And as we remove them, to reveal the next layers and record those. So you build up a whole picture of the site, which you can then reconstruct back in the office.
Mae'r safle yn eithaf cymhleth, gydag amryw o haenau gwahanol. Yr haen gynharaf yw'r strwythur carreg yma, sy'n cyndyddio'r beddau ni wedi cloddio hyd yn hyn. Y strwythur diweddaraf yw wal y capel canoloesol hwyr.
So what we've got here is the west wall of St Patrick's Chapel. This wall was excavated and uncovered in 1924 by excavations then backfilled. We have no idea when it was built at the moment, but it's probably 13th or 14th century, and it's the latest structure on the site. And what's interesting now, we've actually done some work on it and cleaned up all the loose sand between the stones, is we've got more than one phase of building here. There's quite clear break down here. So from here across there is the earliest part of the wall. That's been added on, and between the two is what looks like a block doorway there. So although it's maybe 13th, 14th century, it's been added to at least once and altered. So what we're sitting on here is the earliest built structure of the site. It's made of these massive beach boulders, and it's a wall which runs under everything else on the site. When this wall began to fall apart and sand built up against it, the kiss graves we have on this site were cut through it. And there's one behind me here which is cut right through the wall. We know that some of the graves here that cut through it date to the 7th or 8th century. So clearly the graves post-date not just the wall, but also its destruction, perhaps by 1 or 2 centuries. So what I'm sitting on here is what seems to be the entrance through the wall. This is one side of the entrance opening, this is the other one here, massive stones, entrance through here, which at some point the entrance has been blocked by a position of these 2 stones here and other rubble behind them. I suspect it's going to be an early enclosure wall around an early chapel.
Mae gyda ni enghraifft arbennig o dda fan hyn o bedd cist, neu bedd sydd wedi ei leinio â cherrig, ac mae'n debyg i enghreifftiau eraill o'r cyfnod yng Nghymru. Mae llawer o ymdrech wedi mynd i fewn i creu y bedd hon. Maen nhw wedi rhoi y creigiau yma o amgylch y bedd, ond mae'n debyg bod y bedd hefyd yn eitha dyn.
One of the things about this site which is perhaps unexpected, just how well preserved the human bone is. And most of these sites around the west coast of Britain, the human bone doesn't survive at all well. But here, because it's in wind-blown sand, it's very good preservation, which analysis, you get an awful lot of information from the analysis of the bone, which you can't do on sites where the bone's not so well preserved. It really tells us how the people were living, what their diet was, what their age structure was. A huge amount of information we can obtain from this site, which is often not available from other similar sites in the area.
Mae'r penglog yn fan hyn wedi cael ei diffeithio ychydig oherwydd bod cerrig oedd ar ben y bedd wedi syrthio fewn. Byddwn ni nawr yn cymryd ysgerbwd allan o'r bedd a'i symud i'r labordy mwyn gweld beth oedd ei oed, os mae dyn neu ddynes oedd o, ac hefyd pa mor dal oedd yr unigolyn yma.
With partnership funding from the University of Sheffield, we were able to do a lot more work. There'll be more work on the bones, bone analysis.
Mae pob sgerbwd cafodd ei gloddio yn Capel Sant Padrig nawr wedi dod i'r labordy ostilegol yma ym Mhrifysgol Sheffield, ac mae'r broses o recordio'r olion dynol yn gallu dechrau. Mae'r proses yn dechrau trwy cymryd allan pob asgwrn o'r bocs ac yn osod yn ei le yr un. Ac i ddechrau, mae'n rhaid i ni recordio pa esgyrn sydd yma a pa rai sydd ddim. Wedyn, allwn ni symud ymlaen i gweld os mae dyn neu ddynes oedd yr unigolyn ac hefyd beth oedd ei hoed. Allwn ni hefyd gweithio allan pa mor dal oedd yr unigolyn trwy fesur yr asgwrn hir. Er enghraifft, fyddwn ni'n cymryd yr asgwrn yma, y femur, a'i mesur, ac yna defnyddio'r mesuriad yna gyda fformiwla i gweithio allan pa mor dal oedd yr unigolyn. Felly, yn yr enghraifft yma, mae'n debyg roedd yr unigolyn rhwng 152 a 153 o centimetr o dal. Fyddwn ni hefyd yn edrych ar pob asgwrn ac yn recordio unrhyw newidiadau sydd ella yn ymwneud ac afiechydon neu trauma. Mae pob agwedd o'r sgerbwd yn cael ei recordio ar bapur ac mae o hefyd yn cael ei ffotograffu, fel bod gennym ni record parhaol o'r sgerbwd a'r gwybodaeth. Ar ôl i'r sgerbwd cael ei recordio'n llawn, allwn ni hefyd gwneud gwahanol dadansoddiadau cymegol ar y sgerbwd hefyd. Er enghraifft, allwn ni edrych ar y collagen sydd yn yr esgyrn mwyn deud pa fath o bwydydd oedd yr unigolyn yn bwyta yn ystod y blynyddoedd olaf ei bywyd. Allwn ni hefyd edrych ar elfennau cymegol yn y dannedd, yn benodol strontium ac ocsigen, oherwydd mae'r elfennau yna yn galluogi ni dweud os oedd yr unigolyn yn lleol i'r ardal lle cawsant ei gladdu pan oedden nhw'n blant. Dyn ni'n gallu wneud hynny oherwydd mae strontium ac ocsigen yn adlewyrchu geoleg ac hefyd y tywydd, yr hinsawdd mewn ardal. Ac o'i cymharu â lle cawsant ei gladdu, os maen nhw'r un peth, mae'n amlwg nath yr unigolyn tyfu fyny yn yr ardal honno. Felly, fyddwn ni'n neud y dadansoddiad yma ar y sgerbydau o Capel Sant Padrig i weld os o'n nhw i gyd yn lleol i'r ardal yna, neu os o'n nhw wedi dod o rhywle arall. Yn y diwedd, ar ôl i pob sgerbwd cael ei recordio, bydden nhw'n cael eu pasio ymlaen i'r amgueddfa cenedlaethol yng Nghaerdydd, fel y gall gwyddonwyr ac ymchwilwyr y dyfodol hefyd astudio'r pobl oedd yn byw yn Capel Sant Padrig.
Well, we obtained 4 radiocarbon dates from 4 of the skeletons, and they date from the mid-7th to the early 11th century, which is just what you expect for these sort of kist graves on the west coast of Britain. But they are not the earliest graves on the site. There are some earlier ones which we can just see hints of beginning to appear now, so there will be some earlier skeletons, earlier burials on the site which you need to reveal. It does seem as though the latest use of the cemetery site was suited for children. The small orange peg you see in the section over there was an infant burial just onto the site. Behind me here is another kiss grave of a child. By the size of the grave, it's going to be about a 4-year-old, perhaps a 3-year-old, but I suspect as we get further down we'll find more adult graves and more mixed graves. But to say, at the moment, just children we're dealing with, and many of them.
Here we've got a really small kist grave, very well constructed, the side slabs here, and beautifully covered on the top with quite a large number of white quartz pebbles. And then the stone here, we're not actually sure at the moment whether this is the footstone or whether there was a headstone here, at one point, or whether this is actually a headstone, and which would be unusual because it would mean that this grave was oriented with the head to the east rather than to the west. And most of the burials on this site have been head to the west. So this is quite likely a footstone, and the headstone, if there was one, lost at some time in the past. It's obviously the grave of a very small individual. Measurements yesterday showed it's only 1 metre long, so it's going to be a young child in there. And it's actually the third grave found on this site since we've been excavating over the 2 years that's been of a very young child and covered with these white quartz pebbles. So at the moment it's looking as if this was a treatment in burial of young individuals that wasn't something that was going on for the adults on the site. These stones occur naturally on all the beaches in Pembrokeshire, so they wouldn't have had to go far, just down onto the beach, spend a little time collecting them. But obviously they did have to take that time. There is that care invested in this grave, and that's why we excavate it very carefully in respect of the fact that they took their time and invested care and attention to it. It begs the question, was this left open? We always think of graves as having been dug, placed, the grave is dug, the stones are put in, the burial is placed in there, the covering is put on and then covered with earth. But this suggests that perhaps this was left visible and that they weren't covered over, because this white quartz is obviously highly visible. It really stands out in the site today, and it would have done in the past when it was fresh.
Okay, so we've got a burial of an infant lying on the back in a supine position. You can see that the arm here, this is the right arm, you've got the humerus, the upper arm here, and then the lower arm, you've got the radius and the ulna. The ribs are clearly defined here, and then running down the centre of those ribs you have, of course, the spine here. And then all of this, up the top area, this belongs to the skull, and then the rest of the skull was actually removed yesterday.
Several adults were excavated. One very nice one which had a cross-marked stone at the head of the grave, which is very unusual to find. In fact, it's a unique find in it to have a cross-marked stone with a kiss grave. And the whole series of other graves of similar date to those.
Mae gyda ni claddedigaeth unigryw yn fan hyn, lle mae yna 2 unigolyn wedi eu claddu gyda'i gilydd. Y syniad ydy bod y 2 unigolyn wedi marw unai ar yr un adeg neu yn agos at ei gilydd, ac dyna pam cawsant eu gladdu hefo'i gilydd hefyd. Mae'r braich yma yn perthyn i'r unigolyn yn fan hyn, ac yn amlwg, yn wreiddiol, mi oedd yn gorwedd dros bol yr ail unigolyn. Mae'r llaw wedi clymu yn dyn at ei gilydd. Ella roedd yr unigolyn yn dal ar rhywbeth pan cawsant ei gladdu. Mae'r fraich yr unigolyn yma wedi plygu yn ôl at ei gilydd, ac oedd y llaw yn fan hyn yn agos at y gwddw. Wrth gwrs, mae'n anodd dweud pam cawsant ei gladdu gyda'i gilydd, ond yn y mynwent yma, hwn yw'r unig enghraifft sydd gyda ni hyd yn hyn, lle mae 2 unigolyn wedi eu claddu yn yr un bedd. Cafodd y bedd yma ei dorri drwy gan gladdedigaeth diweddaraf, a dyma pam enghraifft does gynnon ni ddim top y coes yn fan hyn, ac hefyd pan nad oes gynnon ni y penglogau chwaith.
One of the problems we have with this site is the wind-blown sand. It's very easy stuff to dig out, but at the same time it blows back in very quickly. A really good example is just here, where 20 minutes ago we exposed this old ground surface, which is just below the wind-blown sand. And that sand has just come in 20 minutes, half an hour, about 2 or 3 millimetres of sand, which makes life very difficult because it happens all over the site to expose some remains and then they just disappear again and the sand comes over. So you constantly have to battle with trying to record things very quickly as they appear. It's not like a conventional archaeological site where you can trowel over and expose nice big areas of surface, plan them all, and then excavate them all. Here, you have to expose them, try and record them as quickly as possible, and excavate them. Otherwise, you can see here, it's just starting to go again, and as I'm talking, the sand's coming back again. So it's a real problem. We have professional staff here from Dyfed Archaeology Trust and from the University of Sheffield, but actually most of the actual excavation is done by local volunteers, and really without their enthusiasm and very hard work, we wouldn't be able to do this excavation.
Dwi'n feddwl fod e'n bwysig iawn I cael gymaint o bobl I gallu helpu ar projects yma. Does dim digon arian gyda'r trusts a pob un arall I wneud y gwaith yma. A wedyn mae mwy o ddiddordeb gyda bobl I gweld beth sy'n mynd mlaen.
We're not just having to dig holes. We do get to look at the skeletons and go through the whole process. We've learned over the years that we've been involved with planning and section drawing, so we're actually learning new skills all the time.
We wedi joio yn fawr iawn. Mae'n dyddiorol iawn yn meddwl bod y criw wedi dod yma ar wythnos ma'r chwilio am atebion. A maen nhw'n mynd I ffindo atebion, ond maen nhw'n mynd I adael gyda llawer mwy cwestiynau, wy'n siŵr.
I mean, there is so much history here and so little written that it in a way makes it much more interesting.
Dwi wedi gweld lot o pobl lleol yn dod mas a maen nhw eisiau gwybod beth sy'n mynd mlaen a mae diddordeb da nhw a dwi'n credu a pob un yn teimlo mae'n drenu fod popeth yn mynd nôl ar y diwedd ond fel am a bywyd.
There's not a lot of artefacts from the site, which is not surprising. With Christian burials, you don't normally get artefacts buried with them. But we are getting little bits and pieces which are on the site, not actually in the graves. So we have got a Viking age pin, probably made in Dublin in the 10th, 11th centuries. We've got a little bit of an amber bead, which is probably from the Baltic area. Also a small fragment of a small crucible to melt metal in, perhaps bronze. We've excavated this 2 or 3 metre wide strip here. That side remains unexcavated. That side is a sea side of the site which will be eroded. So here we'll now backfill it, returf the site, try and protect as much as we can from the sea for the future, but it will erode. So the idea is this is now archaeologically sterilised, so the erosion can take place across here until it gets to about here where it's unexcavated, and at some point in the future, perhaps 20, 30, 50 years, someone else can come along and excavate that part of the site which is still intact. I'm hoping it will continue for at least one more year. At the moment we haven't quite achieved what we hoped to this year, simply because the site has been so much more complex than we envisaged. So at the end of this season we'll then backfill the site, returf it over and hopefully get some more funding for next year.
Mae cloddion mynwent yn rhoi'r cyfle I ni adlewyrchu ar pwy oedd y bobl yma ac sut oedden nhw'n byw. Mantais o astudio tystiolaeth archeolegol yw bod yn galluogi ni I ailgreu gwahanol agweddau o'r gorffennol.